This coffee from El Salvador is a black honey processed coffee. Before I can talk about the processing of the coffees, I'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of a coffee cherry. The coffee beans that we see here is actually the seed of the coffee cherry fruit. So I'll draw a cross section of a coffee. This is the green bean, and there's also a very thin layer that protects the beans. So this is the green bean. And this thin layer that is the silver skin. So surrounding the silver skin is another layer. This is called parchment. The parchment reminds me of the outer layer of brown rice, so it's usually hulled to expose the inner bean itself. And then we have another layer. This is a very important layer in honey processed coffees. And this is the mucilage. Let's see if I spelled that right. So the mucilage is a very sticky, honey-like layer that coats the bean. After that, we have the pulp. And finally, the outer skin. So before the green bean can be roasted to something that resembles coffee, the fruit of the cherry needs to be removed. And it also needs to be dried. So the bean needs to be dried to make sure the water content inside the bean is lower than a certain percentage. And with processing, it deals with what the farmers do before they really set the bean out to dry. So the most common process method would be washed processing. So that is like this one here. This is from Ethiopia, and it's a washed processed bean. So for washed process, the outer skin, so the outer skin, the pulp, and the mucilage is all removed before drying. So leaving just the parchment, the silver skin, and the green bean. This is definitely the most common processing method because it produces very consistent quality and flavor profiles, so it's easier to control in a larger scale. The second most popular processing method would be natural processing. So for natural processing, just like the name suggests, the coffee cherries are left out to dry without having anything removed. So after they dry, they resemble something like a raisin. Natural processing takes a longer period of time, but it requires no water. One of the downsides of natural processing, and the tricky part, is that it needs a lot of monitoring because of the long drying time, and it's harder to control. And for today's processing method that we're focusing on, the honey processing. Honey processing is quite a new method. It's constantly evolving, and more farms and farmers are taking up this method. So honey processing would be right in between of washed processing and also natural processing. For honey processing, most of the fruit, so the outer skin and also the pulp, would be removed, but leaving the mucilage behind. The mucilage resembles something like a sticky honey layer. I believe that's where the processing method is named after. It's a very popular, it's like rising in popularity in countries like in Central America, such as Costa Rica, and it's adopted by more and more farmers and plants. So for honey processing, there are different levels. The lightest would be white honey or yellow honey. This is the quickest and takes the least amount of time, usually around 1 week. For white or honey or yellow honey processing, the coffee bean is dried under relatively more direct sunlight, so the whole drying process is quicker. For red honey processing, this usually takes around 2 to 3 weeks. The bean is dried under shade or on overcast days, and because of the further drying and the natural fermentation that happens during the drying process, it causes the mucilage that surrounds the green bean to oxidize and darken into a reddish tone. So that's why it's called red honey. Finally, we have the rarest, black honey. Black honey is dried away from the light. That's why it takes the longest amount of time to dry. It's very labor intensive. Because it takes a long time, it also requires a lot of monitoring. So they might become moldy, or they might be over fermented. So workers need to look after these coffee beans a lot more. So sometimes the coloring is also related to how much fruit is removed before the drying process. So for white or yellow honey processing, most of the fruit will be removed and leaving very, very little mucilage behind to dry with the bean. For red honey, there would be a bit more mucilage and maybe some pulp as well. For black honey, it might include a bit more of the pulp. So that is the anatomy of the coffee cherry and the levels of honey processing. So I'd say honey processing is in the middle of washed processing and natural processing. Because it is dried with part of the coffee cherry still attached to the bean, that provides more fruitiness and a bit more complexity compared to washed coffee beans. However, it's not as fruity or not as tropical as natural processed beans. Usually natural processed beans are very fruity, often has a very ripe fruity note, and even like fermented fruit. So very tropical as well. So for instance, jackfruit would be a note that's rather prominent in some naturally processed beans. For honey processed beans, it's sweet, it's fruity, but not too tropical. And because honey processing has very little fermentation during the drying process, there's also less acidity compared to washed beans. Washed beans are often fermented in water. That's why they have a very bright, clear acidity. For this specific one, black honey processing, it provides a very rich mouthfeel, very rich body. It has very nice complexity, but Obviously, it really depends on your own preferences when you're choosing coffee bean. Thank you for watching. I hope to do more videos talking about coffee knowledge and sharing my passion. Thank you.